Hello guys and welcome back to my channel. In this video we'll learn about pivot points in any 3D software. By the end of this video you'll learn what pivot points are, why you need to understand them, and where you need to place the pivot point of your object. So let's get started. Now a pivot point of any object is a point in the world from where that object is transformed. Now what do I mean by the transformation or transform of the object is let's say that over here we have some basic shapes. We have a cube, we have a sphere, we have cylinder, and we have cone. So let's say if I select this sphere, and you can see that on the right side under the details section over here we have a transform tab, and then we have the location, rotation, and scale. Now the location, rotation, and scale are basically the transform of this object. Now this location value basically indicates the exact location where the sphere object is placed inside our world, and the rotation also indicates the rotation of our sphere. Let's say that if I select this cube, and you can see that the location of cube is present over here, and for the rotation it is set to 0 for now. But let's say if I rotate it along z-axis, you can see that the rotation is now changed. And then similarly we have a scale as well. So if we want to scale it along specific axis, like we want to scale it on x-axis, we can change it like this, or you can also click on this lock icon to scale it along all axes, as you can see. So we understand about the transformation of any object. It is basically its location, rotation, and scale value in the world. And now let's talk about the pivot points and why pivot points are important for transformation. Now let's say that if I select this cube, and then if I press W on my keyboard, I can enter this location mode. And similarly, if you press E, you can enter in the rotation mode, and if you press R, you can enter the scale mode. So if I select my cube and I press W key to enter the location mode, you can see that there is a white dot right in the center of this cube. If I can show you from different angles, you can see that it is exactly at the center. So basically this point is the pivot point of this cube. Now you can think of this point as a anchor point for our cube, basically the point from where the transformation for this cube is done. So let's say if I press E on my keyboard and I enter the rotation mode, you can see that the anchor point or our pivot point is still the same. And let's say that I want to rotate it along y-axis. So if I maybe rotate it a little bit, you can see that our rotation is done from this point. Now similarly, if I rotate this cube back and I press R to enter the scale mode, you can see that again our pivot point is same, and if I scale it along x-axis, you can see that it is scaling this cube equally on both sides. So if I place the camera over here and I just scale it on x-axis a little bit, you can see that the size is increased on the left side as well as the right side. And similarly, if I move it a little bit up and I enter the scale mode again, and let's just scale it along z-axis, so you can see that when I scale it along z-axis, it is basically scaling it in both direction, basically in above direction as well as the down direction as well, as you can see. Now for our sphere, you can see that our this pivot point is placed exactly at the center of this object. So let's say if I press E to enter the rotation mode and I rotate it along any axis, maybe y-axis or x-axis or maybe z-axis, now you can see that our sphere is rotating, but we cannot find any difference, or we cannot spot any difference. And because the pivot point of this sphere is placed exactly at the center, so the transformation for the sphere is now calculated along this point, which is again present in the center. So when we rotate the sphere, it feels like it is basically spinning around a specific point, spinning in the circular direction. Now similarly for our cylinder, you can see that the pivot point is again placed at the center of this cylinder, and if I press E to enter the rotation mode and I rotate the cylinder along z-axis, you can see that again it feels like our cylinder is basically spinning around this point. And if I rotate it along y or x axis maybe, so now you can see that our cylinder is now rotated along a specific axis, but our rotation is again done from this specific point. And for the scale, let's say if I press W and move it a little bit up, and I press R to enter the scale mode, and you can also see that the pivot is again at the center. So if I scale it on Z-axis, our cylinder is again scaling in both direction. Now let's say that if the cylinder is placed on the ground, something like this, and we want to increase its height only along the z-axis. So I just simply increase its scale, and now you can see that half of our cylinder is above the ground and the rest of the cylinder is underneath the ground. And this happened because the pivot point for the cylinder is placed exactly at the center, so when we scale it, it scales in the both directions. Now let's say that we want to scale the cylinder only in the above direction. So how we can do that is basically we just need to change the pivot point of the cylinder from center to maybe around over here. And let's just change it, then I'll show you how it will be scaled differently. So to change the pivot point of any object in Unreal Engine, you just need to select the object, and from the top left side we have a selection mode. So we just need to change the selection mode from selection to modeling, and then you can change it. But now you can see that we have a warning. It is saying that the selection includes engine asset which cannot be modified. So that means that this cylinder is basically engine asset, so we cannot modify the engine assets. However, when you import your custom mesh or custom models in Unreal Engine, then you can change it because those meshes would not be the engine assets. However, what we can do is instead of modifying this cylinder, because this is again, I just made it from just simple basic shape like this. So that means that this is a engine asset, so we cannot basically modify it. So instead, what we can do is over here we have a create tab. So we can just simply click on this create, and then over here we have a cylinder. So I'm gonna click it, and now you can see that we can place the cylinder in the world anywhere we want. So let's say we place it over here. Now you can see that when we create a cylinder from modeling mode, you can see that our pivot point, which is this white dot, is placed exactly at the bottom of this cylinder. So let's say if I move it a little bit up, so now you can see that this white point, which is a pivot for this cylinder, is placed at the bottom of the cylinder, and it is placed exactly at the center of this bottom face. So that means that when we move the cylinder or maybe rotate it or maybe scale along any axis, our transformation will happen from this point. Now on the left side we have a height. So let's say if I increase this height, now you can see that our cylinder is only scaling in one direction. So previously when we scaled this cylinder, you can see that I scaled this cylinder and its pivot was somewhere around here. So it scaled in both directions. So half of our cylinder is above the ground and rest of the cylinder is underneath the ground. So now the pivot for this cylinder is placed at the bottom. That means that when we scale, the scaling will happen from this point as well. So that's why it is now only scaling in above direction. Now you can also change the pivot point for this cylinder. So on the left side, you can see the pivot location, which is set to base. So basically the pivot location indicates the location where this pivot point is placed for this specific cylinder. So let's say that when our pivot location or our pivot is placed at the base of the cylinder, I want you to remember how the cylinder basically rotates and scales. So right now our pivot point is set to the base, and let's say that we want to rotate the cylinder along y-axis. So now you can see that when I rotate this cylinder, our rotation is happening from this point. And similarly, if I place my camera somewhere around here so you can see better, if I just increase the size, you can see that the size of our cylinder or the scale of our cylinder is basically again happening from this point. So in that way our cylinder is basically scaling in one direction, which is the above direction. Now let's say that we want to change the pivot of this cylinder from maybe base to maybe somewhere around center. So what we can do is over here we have a pivot location. So we can just simply click on this base drop down, and from here we can set it to centered. And now our pivot for the cylinder would be placed at the center, just like it was for our this normal cylinder. And now if I rotate it, now the rotation is happening from this specific point. And similarly, if I increase the scale, which is this height, now you can see that our cylinder is basically scaling in both direction, because again the pivot point is set to the center of the cylinder, and again scaling is happening in both directions. So now we want that our cylinder should be scaled only in one direction. So what we can do is we can just simply set our pivot to the base like this. And once you're ready, you can just simply click on accept, and it will create a mesh for you. Now we have two cylinders. This cylinder has its pivot point placed at the base or the bottom, and this cylinder have its pivot point placed at the center. Now let's compare both of these. So I'm gonna reset the scale, and I'm gonna place it over here. So let's say I want to scale this cylinder on z-axis. So if I try to scale it, it will scale this cylinder from the center, as its pivot point is basically placed at the center. So you can see that half of the cylinder is above the ground and the rest of the cylinder is underneath the ground. And similarly, if I scale this cylinder, you can see that it is only scaling in the above direction. So no matter how much I scale it, it will only scale in above direction, and there will be nothing under the ground. Now let's say that we want to change the pivot of the cylinder that we just created. We just want to change it again. So previously we changed it when we were basically creating it. So right now this mesh is created, and let's see how we can change its pivot again. So we can just simply select our mesh, and then make sure that you are in modeling mode, and on the left side you have a X form. Just simply click on it, and then you have edit pivot. So if I select it, now you can see that if I move this along any axis, you can see that it is only moving the pivot point for our object. Let's say I want to place it over here, so we can just simply place that uh, not outside the mesh, or maybe somewhere around here inside the mesh. And if I accept it, now my pivot is set over here. So now if I rotate, now my cylinder is rotating from this pivot point, which is this. And now let's say that if I edit the pivot and I set it somewhere outside the mesh, or maybe somewhere over here, now you're gonna see that how the cylinder will rotate. So if I accept it, now the pivot for this cylinder is placed outside the mesh. As you can see, if I click on it, it is placed somewhere over here. And now if I try to rotate it, now you can see that this cylinder is basically rotating along this point. Now also when you click on this edit pivot, you also have some predefined positions where you want to place the pivot. So it is up to you. Instead of just manually dragging the pivot around, you can just simply use these locations, like if you want to set it to center, bottom, top, or wherever you want. You can also set the pivot to the world origin as well, and we'll talk about the world origin in a bit, but you can also change the pivot location like this as well. So let's just set the pivot for the cylinder back to the bottom, and we can click on accept, and we can just save everything. Now let's talk about the world origin a little bit before we continue. So basically over here, when we edit the pivot, we have a option to set the pivot to the world origin as well. So the world origin is basically the origin point for this level, or for this world that we have created. So now let's say that I move this mesh over here, and I also move it along x-axis as well, and then I select it, and then click on edit pivot, and I set my pivot to the world origin. Now you can see that our pivot is placed over here, and this point is our world origin, and I can just simply accept it. And now if I select it and I rotate it, now you can see that our cylinder is now rotating from this point. And if I rotate it on z-axis, you can see how our cylinder is now rotating. So basically the world origin is the origin point of this whole world, which is this whole world. Now let's say that you want to find the world origin. So how you can find it is basically pretty simple. You can just simply select any mesh. Let's say I select my sphere, and you just need to set its location on all the axes to 0. So 0 for x-axis, 0 for y-axis, and 0 for z-axis. So now this sphere is now placed at the world origin for this level. Now you can also think of world origin as a point where when you place any object, its location on all axes becomes 0. So because the world origin is the origin point for this whole level, that's why its location is basically 0 on all axes. Now let's say that if I select my cube and I set its location to 0, 0 and 0 like this, so this cube will also be placed at world origin. Now let's say that if I select this cylinder, you can see that we have some values for its location. So we have values for its location on x-axis, y-axis, and z-axis as well. But let's say if I select this cylinder, you can see that the locations on each axis are set to 0. So it is because the pivot point of this cylinder is placed at the world origin. We just set it, the pivot point from here to the world origin like this. So that makes Unreal Engine think that okay, if the pivot point of this object is placed at the world origin, so that means that its location should be 0 on all axes. Now let's say that if I move this along y-axis, now you can see that the location on the y-axis is changed, and that is because we moved it and our pivot point is now not placed on the world origin. So now our new location value is basically shown over here. Now what this means is basically pivot point is the point from where that specific mesh would be transformed. Either you move it or maybe you rotate it, and this new value is this location value is the basically the distance between your world origin and that specific object's pivot point. So if the pivot point is placed over here, this value would be increased. Now let's say that I will not move this mesh anymore in the world, and I want you to remember the location value on the y-axis, which is -210. And now what I'm going to do is I will change the pivot location back to the maybe bottom of the cylinder or maybe center, and you'll see that this location would be changed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select my cylinder and we can edit pivot, and I'm going to set the pivot back to the maybe let's set it to bottom, and we can just simply accept it. And as soon as I accept it and my pivot is changed, now you can see that our location values are also changed. So that means that these locations are the distance between our world origin and the pivot point of the selected mesh. So now if I just simply set it back to 0, now our mesh is placed at the world origin. And now similarly, if I move it, and our mesh is moving from this point because our pivot is set to the bottom of the cylinder, and also our values are also changing. So that's how basically pivot points and our world origin basically works. So now I'm gonna switch from Unreal Engine to Blender, and let's see how pivot points work in Blender as well. Okay, so here I am in Blender now, and let's just delete everything. So we can press A and then X to delete. And by the way, I'm using a plugin, and you can see whatever button I press on my keyboard and my mouse as well. So you can just simply see it over here. Now, unlike Unreal Engine, we also have a world origin in Blender as well. So let's say if I hold Shift and S, I have a option for cursor to world origin. So basically, this red and white circle, this is basically our 3D cursor. And by default, whenever you open your Blender, your 3D cursor is placed to the world origin. So again, in Blender, world origin is the origin point for this world, and also the location of any object would be 0 when it is placed at the world origin. So you can also spot the world origin in Blender. So let's say if I zoom in, so basically the point where this red line basically indicates the x-axis and this green line indicates the y-axis. So basically the point where both of these lines intersect each other, it is the world origin. Now let's say that I want to add a cube in our scene. So what I can do is I can just simply press Shift and A to open this add menu, and from here we have a mesh, and then over here is our cube. So we can just simply select it and it will add a cube to our scene. Now whenever you add something in Blender, it will add that object wherever this 3D cursor is basically placed. So basically 3D cursor is the point where when you add something from here like mesh, curve, surface or anything, so that specific object would be placed at the 3D cursor. Now if I select my cube, you can see that there is a orange dot right at the center of the cube. So if I go to the front view, you can see it is placed exactly at the center. So basically this is the pivot point for this cube, and again it is placed at the center, and that means that the transformation like location, rotation or scale would happen along this specific point. Now let's say if I select my cube and I press R to rotate it and then Z to rotate it along Z axis, now you can see that our rotation is again happening from this point, which is again our pivot point. And similarly, if I go to front view and then I press S and then x-axis to scale it along x-axis, our scaling is also happening from this pivot point. And as you can see that this cube is scaling in both directions because the pivot point is again placed at the center. Now let's say that I want to change the origin of this cube, and I want to change it from the center and I want to place it to the bottom of this cube somewhere around here. So how we can do that is basically if I select it and then I right click, we have a option for set origin. And now origin is basically the pivot point. It is another name of the pivot point. So if I hover to set origin, we can set the pivot point or the origin to the geometry or maybe 3D cursor, center of mass as well, as you can see. Now we have a option to set the origin to 3D cursor. So let's say that if I hold shift and then right click and I place the 3D cursor somewhere over here, and then I just simply select my mesh and I right click and I set the origin to 3D cursor like this. Now my origin for this mesh is placed over here where my 3D cursor is, and now if I rotate it, it is now rotating along this point. And similarly, if I rotate it on y-axis, you can see that how this cube is now rotating along this pivot point. Now in Unreal Engine, we have a option to set the pivot point wherever we want. Like over here, we have center, bottom, top, or we can just simply select wherever we want the pivot to be, and we can just simply click on accept, and then the pivot is placed at that specific point. But in Blender, we don't have such option. So let's say that we want to place the pivot over here or the bottom of the cube. So we have to do it manually. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna select my mesh and I'm gonna press tab to enter the edit mode. And currently we are in vertex select mode. If I hover over it, you can see that it says vertex select. So either you can click on this button or you can press 3 to enter the face selection mode. So now you can see that I can select any face and I am in face selection mode. So I'm gonna select the bottom face, which is this one, and then we can press Shift and S, and over here we have an option for cursor to select it. And if I do that, now you can see that my cursor is placed exactly at the bottom of this cube and exactly at the center of this specific or this selected face. So now what I can do is I'm gonna press tab to go back to the object mode, and we can just simply select our cube and right click and then set the origin and origin to 3D cursor. And after setting the origin, we can also press shift and S, and we can set the cursor back to the world origin by selecting this cursor to world origin option. And now you can see that our pivot is now set to the bottom of this cube. So now when I rotate it, you can see that our cube is now rotating from this pivot point. And similarly, if I scale it on z-axis, now you can see that our cube is only scaling in top direction. Now if I select my cube and then from the right side I click on this object button, you can see the location over here. So the location for x-axis and y-axis is 0, but for the z-axis is set to 1. And why? Because the pivot is now set to the bottom of this cube, and again the locations are determined or the locations are basically the distance between the world origin and the pivot point of specific object. So if I move this pivot a little bit over here, you can see now our location becomes 0. Now similarly, if I add a sphere, you can see that the pivot point of this sphere is placed exactly at the center. So if I select it and then I rotate it along z-axis, you can see that our sphere is basically spinning around this point. Now let's say that if I select the sphere and I move it along x-axis and place it somewhere over here, and now I want that the pivot point of this sphere should be placed at the world origin. So I know that my 3D cursor is placed at the world origin. So what I can do is I can just simply select my sphere and then right click and then set origin and then origin to 3D cursor. So in this way, our pivot for this sphere would be placed at the world origin, and you can also see that our locations are also changed. So our x location now becomes 0. So now if I select my sphere and I rotate it along z-axis, now you can see that our sphere is not spinning anymore, but it is rotating from this point. Now here I have a door model that I will import to Unreal Engine, and as you can see, if I select my door, the pivot point for this door is placed at the center or the middle of this door. So what that means that when we try to open it, the rotation for this door would happen from this point. So if I select my door and I rotate it along z-axis, because that's how we open the door, we just simply rotate the door along z-axis. So right now you can see that when I try to rotate the door or try to open the door is basically rotating from the center point. So in that way, the door mesh is basically rotating from both sides. So to fix the rotation of our door, we need to set the pivot point of this door somewhere around here. So how we can do that is we can just simply select our door and then press tab to enter the edit mode, and then you need to press 2, or you can just simply click over here to go to the edge selection mode, and then we can select this edge and we can just press shift and S, and over here we have cursor to selected. So what will that do is it will basically place the cursor at this edge. And now we can just simply press tab to exit the edit mode and come back to the object mode. And then we can just simply select our door and right click and then set origin to 3D cursor. Now our pivot point for this door is now placed over here. So now if I select my door and I try to rotate it along z-axis, you can see that our door is now opening correctly. Now let's export this door so that we can import it in Unreal Engine. So I'm gonna select the door and then go to File, Export, and then FBX, and I'm gonna rename it as door. And for these settings, I have created some presets, and this one is for UE5 static meshes, and this one is for skeletal meshes. So I'm gonna select the static mesh one, and the settings are basically the path mode is set to copy, and this option is enabled, and then batch mode is set to off, and then limit to selected objects, and we only want to export the mesh, so I just selected the mesh, and make sure to change the forward axis to X and the up axis to Z. And then for the geometry, just change this smoothing from normals only to faces, and that's it. So we can now just simply export the store. Now let's go back to Unreal Engine, and I'm gonna open up my content drawer, and over here I have created a tutorial folder, and I will import the door inside this folder. So I'm gonna click on this import, and over here we have our door that we just exported. So I'm gonna select this door and click on open to import this door to Unreal Engine. So here our door is imported, as you can see. So if I place this door inside my level, right now you can see that the pivot point of this door is still placed at the center. So if I move it a little bit up and then I press end on keyboard to just align it with the ground, so now you can see that our pivot point is still placed at the center of this door. However, in Blender, we changed the pivot point, but when we export this door and then import it to Unreal Engine, our pivot point is set to the center of this door. And similarly, if I try to rotate this door is basically again rotating from center. So that's why it is basically rotating from both sides. So the pivot point of this door is placed at the center because whenever you model anything in Blender, you can change the pivot point of your model in Blender. But when you export that model, Blender automatically sets the pivot point of your model to the world origin. So the world origin is somewhere over here where these two lines basically intercept. This is our world origin. So that's why when we export this model, our pivot point for this model is placed somewhere over here, which is again at the center of this door. So that's why when we import it to Unreal Engine, our pivot is set to the center. Now there are two ways that you can set your pivot. You can either set your pivot in Unreal Engine or you can set it in Blender as well. So let's see how we can set our pivot in Unreal Engine. So you just need to select your mesh and then from here go to the modeling section and then in Xform, and you can edit the pivot from here. And now you can just simply manually adjust where you want to place the pivot, or you can just if I cancel it and I do it again, you can also place it somewhere like center, bottom, top, or maybe back and front. So let's say if I place it over here in front at this corner and then I accept it, and now you can see that if I rotate this door is now rotating correctly because our pivot is placed over here. Now let's say that we want to fix the pivot of this door in Blender. So I'm gonna open up my Blender, and right now our pivot is placed at the correct spot. Now all we have to do is we just need to place this mesh at our world origin. So I'm gonna press Shift and S, and over here I have a option to set the cursor to world origin, so we can place our cursor back to the world origin, and then we can select our door model and we can press Shift and S again, and then we have a selection to cursor. So now you can see that our model is now placed at the world origin. So now if we export it and then import it to Unreal Engine, our pivot point would be placed over here. So I'm gonna select my door and I go to my file and then export FBX, and all I'm gonna do is just simply select the door. So in that way it will replace the door, so we can export it. And now let's go back to Unreal Engine, and I'm gonna delete this door and I'm gonna open up my content drawer and I'm gonna delete these as well, as we will re-import the model. So let's just import this door again, and now you can see that if I place the door in the level, our pivot point is placed at the correct spot, and if we rotate it, you can see that our door is rotating correctly. So similarly, I have a cart over here. So this is basically my cart's body. And then we have some wheels over here, and these are named accordingly. Now if I select any wheel and then I rotate it along x-axis, you can see that my wheels are not spinning, but they are rotating around this point because their pivot is placed over here. So let's say we want to rotate the wheel. So in order to rotate the wheel, we need to set the pivot of this wheel right at the center. So I'm gonna select my wheel and then we can set origin and then origin to geometry. And now you can see that our pivot for this wheel is placed at center. And now if I try to rotate it, you can see that my wheels are basically rotating uh, or basically spinning around the x-axis. Now let's say that if I select my wheel and I set their origin to maybe 3D cursor or the world origin, in this way when I export this whole model will be exported correctly, but the origins for my wheels would be placed at center. So that means that I will have to manually set the pivot points of each and every wheel in Unreal Engine. So let me show you. So I will select everything, and I'm gonna go to File, Export, and FBX, and I'm gonna rename it as Cart. And I'm gonna again set the preset to UE5 mesh and just simply export it. And then in Unreal Engine, I'm gonna create a new folder and I'm gonna rename it as cart, and I'm gonna import this cart in this folder. Now you can see that our cart is basically imported into smaller meshes. As we have in Blender, we have separate meshes for wheels and a separate mesh for the cart body. And similarly over here we have a cart body and we have some wheels as well. So if I select my first mesh and then shift select my last mesh and drag everything into my level, you can see that our cart is now placed. However, the pivot points for my wheels are again placed at the center. That means that when I try to rotate them, they will not spin, but they will rotate from this point as they were placed in Blender. Now again, you can change the pivot location in Unreal Engine by going to the modeling section and then XForm and then edit pivot, and then you can just simply place the pivot to center like this and then accept it. And now if you select your wheel and you try to rotate it, you can see that our wheel is now spinning at place. Or you can just simply go back to the Blender and then select your wheel and then set the origin to your maybe origin to geometry for each wheel like this. I'm gonna set it, oops, origin to geometry and origin to geometry and origin to geometry as well. And then I'm gonna select this wheel and then shift S and selection to cursor and then selection to cursor as well, and for this wheel as well, and for this wheel as well. So if you do it like this way, then you manually have to place the wheels wherever they are placed in Blender. So it is up to you. So let's say that I just simply select everything and I go to File, Export, FBX, and I'm gonna rename it as cart underscore 02 maybe, and let's just export that. Now let's come back to Unreal Engine and I'm gonna open up my content drawer and let's create a new folder and let's import this code in here like this. And now you can see that if I select my cart or select these meshes and I place them over here, now you can see that my wheels are just placed at the center. So that means that I have to manually select each and every wheel. So this means that it is front wheel R2. So I'm gonna place it manually like this. So basically it is up to you how you want to set your pivot points. So if you set them in Unreal Engine, after exporting your model, it would be much easier, as you can see that our wheels are placed at the correct spot. But if you do this method where you fix the pivot points in Blender and then export the model, then you manually have to basically reposition your wheels, and that can be a little bit tricky, as you cannot place wheels exactly the same way that you have placed them in Blender. So for this mesh, I would suggest to just simply export everything and then just set the pivots in Unreal Engine. Now I also want to talk about the modular meshes in this video as well, because my last video was about modular characters, and someone asked me that why we basically pivot everything to the root, or basically why we set the pivot point of each and every mesh to the root, or you can say to world origin. So I will try my best to answer their question as well. Now we know that when we develop a modular mesh, we basically split our model into smaller parts. So over here I have a gun model, and this gun is split into different parts. Like over here we have a silencer, and we have a magazine, then we have a stock, and our body of our gun, and similarly we have a scope. And now all these meshes are basically parented to this skeleton. Now this is very basic rig that I have created for this gun, But if you can see that if I press Ctrl and Tab to enter the pose mode, now you can see that if I select my this handle bone or grip bone, I can rotate it, and my gun is also rotating with this bone. And similarly, I have a bone for my magazine. Now you can see that if I move this bone, only my magazine is moving along with this bone. So whenever you develop any modular mesh, it can be either modular weapon or modular character, and you also assign a skeleton to it. That means that you are creating a skeletal mesh. So for this mesh, you don't need to assign the pivot points for each and every mesh separately. All you can do is you just simply place the pivot points at your world origin, and then you just simply parent everything with your skeleton. Now, why don't you need to assign the pivot points for each of these meshes separately? Is because all of these meshes are basically parented to this skeleton, and when you parent something to a skeleton, that means that whenever you move your skeleton, all of those meshes will also follow the location of the skeleton. Similarly, if I select my skeleton and I move it maybe along z-axis, now you can see that the location of my skeleton is updated on z-axis because we moved it on z-axis. However, if I select my silencer, you can see that its location is still set to 0. Similarly, the location for my body is again set to 0, and the location for my stock is set to 0 as well. Now if I select my skeleton and I rotate it as well, and now you can see that our rotation for the skeleton is also updated, but similarly the rotation for my silencer or body or maybe scope or magazine is still set to 0. Now that means that whenever you parent something with a skeleton, the actual transform or the actual location or rotation of that specific object is not updated. It only follows the transformation of the skeleton. So that's why whenever you design any modular mesh, either modular character or modular weapon, you just assign the pivot points of each and every mesh to the world origin, and you also assign the pivot for your skeleton to world origin as well, because when you make animations for your skeletal meshes, you don't make animations in object mode. You basically go to pose mode and then make animations in pose mode. Now in pose mode, if I select this grip bone and I rotate it along x-axis, you can see that our gun model is also moving and our skeleton is also moving. And similarly, this bone is assigned to my magazine, and this bone is also parented to this grip bone. So that means that if I move it, only my magazine is currently moving. So that's how you basically create animations. And also, let's say if I move my this bone somewhere over here and I place it over here, now you can see that the pivot point for our this armature or the skeleton is still placed at the world origin. So that means that no matter where you place your model in pose mode, the pivot for your skeleton would always remains at the world origin or wherever you have placed it before moving the model, and also the pivot of your other meshes would also remains at the same place. So that means that moving your meshes in pose mode doesn't affect their pivot points. It just remains same. So that's why we just set the pivot points for each of our meshes to our world origin, and keeping the pivot points to our world origin also makes it easy for us to export this model, and when we import it to Unreal Engine, everything would be placed exactly at the same spot. So let me show you how you can export this model and then import it to Unreal Engine. Now because this is a modular weapon, so we need to export it in smaller pieces. So I'm gonna select my skeleton, and then I'm gonna select my this silencer, and then go to File, Export, FBX. I'm gonna rename it as silencer, and the preset I'm gonna choose for skeletal mesh, and we can export it. So we got our silencer, then I'm gonna select my skeleton and then magazine, then export it as well, and then I'm gonna select my skeleton and my body, So now I have exported this model into smaller pieces, and now let's go to Unreal Engine, and over here I have a gun folder, and I will import this model in this gun folder. So I'm gonna import it. So let's import our gun body first. So I'm gonna select it and then make sure that the skeleton is set to none, and we can import it like this. So our body is here. Now let's import our magazine. So I'm going to select the magazine and then open, and now this time make sure that the skeleton is set to the body skeleton, because again they both share the same skeleton. So make sure the skeleton is set to body skeleton, and we can import it. And then we can import our stock, and again make sure that the skeleton is again set correctly. And then we got our silencer, and then lastly we have a scope as well, which is this. So now we can save. Now let's say that we want to assemble this mesh, so it will take a lot of time to manually assemble it, and we also might not be able to assemble it correctly as it is assembled in Blender. So that's why we set the pivot points to the same point. So now we know that the pivot points of all of these meshes are placed at the same point. So what we can do is we can just simply select all of these meshes by holding Control and then selecting this mesh, and then we can just simply drag and drop into our level. And now you can see that our gun is basically fully assembled just like it is in Blender. Now we don't need to worry about the rotations for these meshes, because again these are skeletal meshes, and when we create animations in Blender, we create it in pose mode again, and when you import that animation in the Unreal Engine, the animation is basically played on skeleton, and the skeleton of all of these meshes is same. So whatever animation you make in Blender would play exactly the same in Unreal Engine as well. Now similarly, for a modular character, you also set the pivot of your meshes to the world origin, and you also set the pivot for your skeleton to world origin as well, and then just parent everything with the skeleton. And when you create animations for your player character, again animations are created in pose mode, so that means that it will not affect the actual transformation of your character mesh. And when you set the pivot point of each and every mesh to the world origin, and then just export it from Blender and then import it to Unreal Engine, the placement of each meshes would be exactly the same. Now let's say we want to export this mesh from Blender, so I'm gonna select my skeleton, and then I'm gonna export this mesh in pieces as well. So I'm gonna select my head and then go to File, Export, FBX, and I'm gonna rename it as head, and the preset would be skeletal mesh, and I will export it. And then I'm gonna select my skeleton again, and then let's export the chest. So we got our chest, and then similarly we're gonna export our arms, and then lastly our legs. Now let's go to Unreal Engine and import our character. So I'm gonna open up my content drawer, and let's import our character inside this character folder. So I'm gonna start with importing the arms, and make sure the skeleton is set to none. And then let's import our head, and this time make sure the skeleton is set to the arm skeleton, and we can import it as well. And then our chest, again make sure the skeleton is set. And then lastly for our legs, I'm gonna select my legs, and again make sure the skeleton is set correctly. And now we can just simply again select our arms, then our head, and then our chest, and then our leg, and we can just simply drag everything and place it inside our level. Now I know the scale is a little bit big, but now you can see that our character is again fully assembled as it is placed in Blender, and the pivot point for our character is again set to the world origin over here. And again, whatever animation we create in Blender, it will be created in pose mode. So when we export it, everything would work just simply fine. So lastly, you just set the pivot points for your modular characters to the root, or you can say to the world origin, so that it is easy for you to assemble your character when you basically import it to Unreal Engine. So that's it for this video. I hope you guys like it. If you guys like it, please make sure to leave a like and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more content, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.